The genius of critical theory was twofold. First, each area of critical theory could appear to be unique and self-contained. For example, feminism could attack Western culture from the perspective of its oppression against women, and that oppression must be unique to Western culture. No mention was made of what the ancient Chinese or the Aztecs or the Persians or anyone else, how they had treated women. Only the oppression of women in the West was on the table.
I'm not going to bore you with a detailed history of the marriage of feminism and Marxism. For that, I will quote feminist Catherine McKinnon, who said, "Feminism, socialism, and communism are one and the same. Socialist communist government is the goal of feminism." I'll also refer any who are interested to a lengthy but fascinating lecture by Soviet expatriate Valdis Analuskas, who describes a courtship between Marxism and feminism that began in the mid-1800s. And I will note as well that the rhetoric about women's position in society expressed in the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls in the 1850s mirrored almost exactly that expressed in the writings of many communists of that era. The only significant difference was that it was men rather than the wealthy elites who were cast as the universal villain. It is a Marxist rhetoric of class oppression in which women are the proletariat, exploited and subjugated by their fathers, husbands, brothers, and even sons, the way workers were allegedly exploited by the bourgeoisie. The entire conceptual model of the patriarchy is simply Marxism repurposed and applied to the relationship between the sexes. Men collectively as a class oppress women collectively as a class. The intellectual backlash against feminism that began within the Marxist community around the turn of the 20th century with E. Belfort Bax and Robert Briffault, whose observations and grievances regarding feminism are still relevant and applicable today, was quashed through intimidation, censorship, and the skillful use of emotionally charged propaganda. Bax himself seemed bemused by the power of women within Marxism to convince people that up was actually down. For instance, that women were more harshly treated by the criminal justice system when all available empirical data demonstrated the exact opposite.
American women have been defeminized, ironically, by feminism. And a lot of American women, they want that CEO clout even without the success. And that's kind of annoying.
Back in the days, most of the time, you would wait for someone to make the first move. It might be on the first date, it might be the third date, whatever. It could be the man, it could be the woman. But now, all my friends have noticed that the man has stopped making the first move. All my girlfriends are like, they're waiting, it's the third date, fourth date, a week later, he hasn't gone in for the kiss, he doesn't do any touching or anything. And I've asked my dude friends that are single, and they are like, you don't know where a woman's gonna go with that story anymore. I ain't touching nobody. And it sucks because the Me Too movement is so strong and so powerful for the people that need it, but it shouldn't ruin the maturity that we should have within intimacy and relationships.
And all right, I'm going to be blunt here, okay? This is all the fault of feminism. If you say, I am a feminist, you are part of the problem. Feminists originally presented a case which was that women should not be denied jobs just because they're women. Feminists won their battle. At that point, they should have just stopped. Then they tried to go around shifting the culture. And they were shifting the culture to this. Women should all be CEOs. Not only should women be able to work, but if women don't work, and if women don't want to be hugely successful lawyers or doctors or politicians or CEOs or something that commands a great deal of respect, well, then they are bad feminists. These feminists, they denigrated and they ridiculed the concept of the good wife and mother to the point that the term housewife is now spoken with derision in America. Their strategy is to humiliate people into conforming. It's a juvenile approach to getting what they want. It's the schoolyard bully method. Good men in America are treated like second-class citizens. And because corporations tend to favor hiring and advancing women over men in corporate jobs, we now have a lot of women in high-power positions that they don't deserve. It's like the popular interpretation of DEI so brilliantly spells out, DEI didn't earn it.
In today's climate, it only takes one accusation, whether true or not, to derail a man's career. The power dynamics are clear. One email, call, or chat with HR, and a man's livelihood hangs in the balance. Men feel like they're presumed guilty until proven innocent, a chilling prospect for anyone. If a woman were to falsely accuse a man of harassment, he could lose his job, his reputation, and any hope of future employment.
You can see the worldview of patriarchy theory expressed very plainly in the very first officially recognized collective feminist document, published the same year as the Communist Manifesto, the Declaration of Sentiments. In part, it stated, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her." The Declaration then presents a laundry list of social, political, and legal norms to support this supposition, and absolutely none that might possibly call it into question. So when I talk about feminism, I'm talking about an ideology and its associated movement that is based in whole or in part on the following propositions. 1. That society currently and historically is patriarchal. 2. That patriarchy is a social system wherein men hold the majority of the economic, social, and political power and women are largely excluded from it, resulting in 3. Systemic male privilege and the systemic oppression of women. We are then left with the very sticky secondary belief that is never spoken, but is the inevitable outcome, the inevitable conclusion of feminism's patriarchy hypothesis. Men are so awful, they will willingly and willfully and knowingly perpetuate a system that causes them harm, often in egregious and horrific ways, so that they can maintain their collective systemic power to oppress women. Now, I make no claim that these secondary beliefs are any part of the conscious thought processes and feelings of most feminists. Generally, it's only been the most radical who've been willing to consciously travel down this ugly branch of feminist logic. They are the feminists who've advocated male genocide, like Sally Miller Gerhardt and Mary Daly, the ones who, like Brown, Miller, and McKinnon, have described rape as part of a concerted male campaign to keep women subjugated and terrorized, and who describe women's oppression by men as the wellspring and the blueprint for all other forms of human exploitation and conflict. Most modern feminists will tell you they don't hate men. They don't blame men for the system. They don't see men as the enemy. Yet, they believe in the very propositions that would justify, or arguably necessitate, the characterization of men as an enemy worthy of hate. I'm not a feminist because I don't believe their hypothesis of patriarchy as a system that privileges men at the expense of women. I don't believe their hypothesis because not only have they never attempted to falsify it themselves, but they actively seek to discredit, discourage, and demonize those who do want to attempt to falsify it, or to present alternative hypotheses to explain gender differences and our perceptions of gender. That's why I'm not a feminist. I don't believe feminism's core assumptions. Not only have they not demonstrated to me why I should believe their patriarchy narrative, they have been consistently unable to convincingly address the significant amount of evidence that calls their narrative into question.
If you look at the National Organization for Women and their extended, long history of advocacy against shared parenting legislation, they will not support any legislation that would make the starting point in a divorce be that if neither parent is unfit and both parents want it, shared parenting is the starting point. The National Organization for Women has consistently opposed this, and they have opposed it on the basis that it, number one, would endanger women and children because the men might be abusive. They oppose the legislation by portraying it as something that would be forced.
The Duluth model. That's the feminist model. It's entirely based on patriarchy theory and feminist notions of gender power relations, particularly sociological and political ones. Domestic violence is primarily a problem of patriarchal masculinity. Men are trained by cultural norms to see women as subhuman subordinates and to enforce male dominance over women and children through family violence and intimate terrorization. This hypothesis of patriarchal terrorism is otherwise known as the Duluth model. It's been described as a data-impervious paradigm by researchers like Dawn Dutton, and what it essentially does is it applies a single ideologically poisoned cure to a multifaceted problem, treating people for diseases they don't have while leaving their actual problems to fester. I'd love to see male victims of domestic violence receive the same care and assistance that female victims do. Be treated through counseling, rather than sort of an enforcement of permanent family separation. I'd like to see men with children have better options than 1. Risk a kidnapping charge, 2. Leave the kids alone with a violent woman, or 3. Stay and swallow the abuse. I'd like to see men who call the police for help have a better chance of being helped than arrested, instead of the other way around, like it is now. How do I convince lawmakers and bureaucrats and directors of agencies to abandon a model built on the ideologies of feminism without ever mentioning the word feminism? Both men and women can be batterers and are at roughly equal rates. And this was the school of thought embraced by Erin Pizzey, a woman who grew up with 2 violent and abusive parents, and who went on to open the world's first battered women's shelter. It's called Chiswick Women's Aid in 1971. Her experiences in the shelter, where 60% of the women she helped were as violent as or more violent than the men they were fleeing. And these women were often also violent with other female residents and their children, both the other residents' children and their own. Now, initial gender-neutral studies that started coming out in the late 1970s and early 1980s by Murray Strauss, and hundreds of much more thorough and detailed ones over the past 30 years, have confirmed her hypothesis. When Erin Pizzey first began talking publicly about violent women and the true nature of domestic violence, she was protested by feminists, and picketed by feminists, and threatened by feminists. Her charity was subject to a hostile takeover by feminists. She ended up having to have a police escort everywhere she went, and she was instructed to have all her mail redirected to the unit. When her family dog was shot, she finally fled the UK and ended up living in hiding in the US for more than 10 years. That was how difficult the feminist establishment made her life, merely for saying women can be violent too.
The main difference between what was before and what is now is that men got their kids because men were 100% financially responsible for their children, right? So when men got their kids, they got the entire bill, right? And then when the tender years doctrine came into effect and women started getting default custody, women got custody and men got the bill.
Theodore Roosevelt's 1904 campaign to revive the whipping post as a punishment specifically for men who beat their wives. He claimed that such men were repugnant to any right-thinking person, and 30 lashes would not cause hunger or want to a woman the way imprisoning or fining the husband would. Contrast that with what feminists of the second wave told us about domestic violence against women being considered socially acceptable until they came along to show us all the light. Contrast it again with the axiomatic assumption required to consider the patriarchy a valid model, that men in power will act primarily for men's benefit to the detriment of women. Still, a lot of people believed their claims. Under second wave feminism, family was reinterpreted as an institution based on exploitation. Instead of all members working together for the benefit and shared success of all members, women were recast as powerless subordinates providing unreciprocated labor toward the raising of his children and the keeping of his house, never hers in any context. Labor that freed him to pursue economic and social power outside the home. It didn't matter that most men throughout history had little more access to economic and social power than most women, or that what power men achieved they were expected to share equitably with their families. Feminists were too busy pointing upwards. They envied the power of history's generals and statesmen, but spared little thought for history's thousands of young foot soldiers dead in trenches. The 23-cent average apples to oranges annual wage gap is still in their minds the height of sexist injustice, but the greater than 93% workplace death gap, who cares? Traditional ways of providing for and protecting women that were absolutely necessary in the pre-industrial past were reinterpreted by feminism as male oppressors keeping women down all through history for men's benefit. And as an interesting side note, a few years ago, a man in France was ordered by a judge to pay his ex-wife over $10,000 in punitive damages because he didn't give her enough sex during their marriage. Can any of you imagine the media outcry had a man even attempted to sue his ex-wife for not putting out enough for his liking while they were married? Can you imagine the code-red, apoplectic, spittle-flecked level of moral outrage that would have accompanied a verdict in his favor? If we are expecting our children to bail us out of this fiscal and human mess we are creating, we are in for a nasty surprise, because they aren't going to be able to do it. This is a problem of snowballing costs that will only worsen with each generation as governments get more bloated and top-heavy to implement all of them and enforce all of them, while simultaneously crippling the ability of future generations to support it. It is a system where we examine the reading scores of 8-year-old boys not to determine how best to help boys stop falling behind in education, but to determine how many prisons we're going to need in 30 years. It is a system wherein a man who is laid off and temporarily unable to pay his child support is systematically stripped of his driver's license, his professional licenses, and then thrown in debtor's prison to the tune of $60,000 of taxpayer money every year, saddled with a criminal record that renders him permanently unable to pay his child support. You know, we are literally metaphorically chopping his arms off and then telling him to shovel for all he's worth or he's going to be sorry. And behind all of this, you will find radical feminist lobbyists pushing for further reforms for women to undo millennia of oppression of women that never actually existed the way they think it did, and regardless of the collateral damage to other members of society, including their own children. They do this in the name of liberating women from the oppression of their historical and reciprocal dependence on men by constructing enormous government bureaucracies ever growing in power and scope, funded disproportionately by men, and upon which women in general have become just as dependent as they ever were on any man. All for the purpose of ending oppression. Because as I know you guys all believe, no government anywhere ever oppressed anybody.